Good evening. I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Monday, September 26th. We begin tonight on the East Coast, where residents in Atlantic Canada and Eastern Quebec are taking stock and assessing the damage. This comes after one of the strongest storms the area has ever faced. Members of the Canadian Armed Forces are being deployed to help with recovery efforts. Defense Minister Anita Anand says about 100 troops apiece will be dedicated to help with the cleanup in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and PEI. All right, well, meanwhile, federal ministers say all COVID border restrictions will end as of Saturday. The Ministers of Health, Transportation, and Public Safety have announced that the orders for mandatory vaccinations, testing, and the quarantine of international travelers will be expiring, as well as mandatory masks on planes and trains. Federal officials say travelers can still use the Arrive Can app to submit customs and immigration declarations before they arrive at certain airports, but it will not be required going forward. All right, well, back in Quebec, the post-tropical storm cleanup in the Île-de-la-Madeleine region was the backdrop for a pair of campaign stops today. Two of Quebec's main party leaders are planning to visit the disaster zone. This is where a hotly contested riding is in play. Parti Québécois leader Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon spoke to reporters yesterday. He said that Quebecers hit by natural disasters in the past haven't gotten the support they needed. Coalition Avenir Quebec leader François Legault is also expected to visit the riding, which his party hopes to win from Mr. Plamondon's party next week. On the West Coast, police and health officials in the Okanagan region of BC are sounding the alarm. This comes after 5 people died of overdoses in the span of 9 hours this past Saturday. The deaths occurred in Kelowna, and police say officers responded to 3 different locations. The RCMP are asking anyone who uses drugs to be safe by never using them alone. They also recommend using at safe injection sites, testing drugs before use, and carrying naloxone. Moving to Ontario now, where all adults can now book an appointment to receive an Omicron-targeted COVID-19 vaccine. The province has announced that the bivalent vaccine is available to all residents 18 or over as of today. Health Minister Sylvia Jones says getting a booster dose is especially important. This comes with the start of the fall and winter respiratory illness season. The Ministry of Health recommends a 6-month wait between booster doses. A man killed in a brutal stabbing rampage in Saskatchewan was honored at the Walk for Veterans over the weekend in Prince Albert. Earl Burns was a veteran with Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, and his family says he died protecting them during the attacks on the James Smith Cree Nation and in the community of Weldon earlier this month. One speaker at the event said Mr. Burns died a warrior's death. The Walk for Veterans, which raises funds to support vets, was one of 11 that took place nationwide. All right, well, next door in Manitoba, the government says it's providing more than $370,000 to support events leading up to Orange Shirt Day this Friday. Also known as the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, the events will promote awareness of the history and legacy of residential schools. Events that will receive support include the Manitoba Museum's 3-day free admission, Orange Shirt Day, and the Two-Spirited People of Manitoba's 6th annual powwow. The province has said Friday won't be a statutory holiday, but non-essential government services and offices are to close along with schools. The third largest bank in Canada is getting a new president. Scotiabank says Chief Executive Brian Porter will retire at the end of January next year. The bank says he will be replaced by Scott Thompson. He is currently the president and chief executive of heavy equipment dealer Finning International Incorporated. Mr. Thompson has been a member of the Scotiabank board since 2016. He will retire from Finning on November 15th, and he will become president at Scotiabank starting December 1st. This is before taking over as chief executive on February 1st, 2023. Sprinter Andre DeGrasse, sports anchor Kayla Gray, and filmmaker Fabienne Cola were among the honorees at the Legacy Awards on Sunday night. Actor Shamir Anderson and Stefan James founded the Legacy Awards. This was in order to spotlight exceptional Black Canadians with a platform that they felt was lacking. Mr. DeGrasse, a 6-time Olympic medalist, was honored as Athlete of the Year for his accomplishments in sport in Canada and the world. All right, stay with us. Up next, we'll have a discussion about the increasing Indigenous population in Canada's child welfare system. We'll have our interview with Cora Morgan from the First Nations Family Advocate Office after the break, so stay tuned. We'll be right back. The number of newborns taken into care dropped dramatically as birth alerts ended across Canada. However, child welfare experts warn that ceasing the practice alone cannot be the only step that governments take to keep families together. The latest census data from StatsCan indicates Indigenous children continue to be overrepresented in the child welfare system. They make up 53.8% of foster care children in Canada. Advocates point to the children who were taken from their families through the residential school system and the 60 scoop that continue to face mental health issues and trauma. Cora Morgan from the First Nations Family Advocacy Office says that government reforms alone won't get to the root of the issue and that officials need to invest in prevention and healing. Ms. Morgan joins us now. Ms. Morgan, welcome to Forum Daily.
Hi there. Thank you for having me.
So let's start with how the practice of birth alerts has impacted First Nations communities in Canada in particular.
Well, we've had over 150 years of stolen children, from residential school to 60 scoop to, the practice of day school is now the current child welfare system. And one of the common practices has been the use of birth alerts, meaning alerting that a mother is potentially unfit to parent her child. And so um, that was the act of issuing these alerts on mothers, and then different entities intervening and perhaps apprehending the baby at birth. And so there's two things: there's the use of birth alerts and unfairly targeting mothers, and then there's also the actual act of taking newborn babies, which is really devastating.
And many experts, including yourself, say ending birth alerts is just the first step to addressing these systemic issues that are facing Indigenous children in childcare. So, what are the other steps that need to be taken?
Well, of course, we need to use birth alerts. We also have to go back to restored jurisdictions of our First Nations, being able to take control of the child welfare systems and implementing, First Nations led approaches to caring for children and families. We need to do a lot of work to address the social issues that have become quite challenging and rampant as a result of over 150 years of stolen children. Our elders say the most violent act you can commit to a woman is to steal her child. And so when you think about, the hundreds of thousands of First Nations people who've been affected by having their children taken and those children being displaced, there's a lot of damage that's been done. So there's really a need for, healing and getting to the root cause. And, we have really challenging issues of poverty in this country. And, particularly here in Manitoba, we have the biggest riding in all of Canada, and over 60% of the children are living far below the poverty line. So, when you have those kind of issues that are happening in our country, those things need serious attention and address, and real commitments to create change and finding alternatives to apprehending. A lot of times when you've taken so many generations of children, you need to be able to invest in bringing back ability to parent. So many people have been taken by systems that when they go and have their own children, they've never been raised in a loving, caring home, and really need to have the opportunity to experience that and know how to do that.
All right, Ms. Morgan, a little over a minute left here, but I want to jump to a recent deal, a $20 billion settlement agreement, the largest in history, to compensate Indigenous children impacted by the underfunded child welfare system. So what are your thoughts on this program? Is it enough to deal with this intergenerational trauma, with the hundreds of years of abuse that Indigenous communities have faced?
Well, of course, I'm never going to agree that it's going to be enough, because there's been a lot of, irreparable damage. The $20 billion deal is a capper on what potential damage could have been done. There's no real true numbers that is attached to and account for, and you have to realize that for many of our First Nations children, if they were born with any kind of extra medical needs, And part of the practice, particularly in our provinces, is that if a community or First Nation didn't have the medical tools or resources or professional people to care, those children were automatically apprehended from their nations and put into the foster care system. And so that $20 billion has to account for all those children who were just apprehended merely because there wasn't enough um, care offered or capacity for medical care in those communities. So it's encompassing a real large number of children, and I don't think there's a real true account of how many children that covers. So, and it's kind of up in the air between the age range of or years that this is happening.
As Canada's energy industry continues to struggle to achieve its goal to decarbonize, advocates say that Canada needs to seriously consider nuclear energy as an alternative. A recent House of Commons petition, signed by over 10,000 Canadians, called on federal officials to include nuclear energy within Canada's Green Bond framework. However, officials have indicated that nuclear electricity generation will continue to be excluded from the framework, which is in line with other comparable G7 sovereign green bond issuers. But those for nuclear energy say it is imperative to include nuclear as a decarbonization tool, given the urgency of climate change. Well, joining us now to tell us more about this is Dr. Chris Keefer, an doctor in Toronto and president of Canadians for Nuclear Energy. Dr. Kiefer, welcome back to Forum Daily.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Now, taking a look at the government's response to this petition, it says that it continues to work with the nuclear sector at large. It's pointing to initiatives like the SMR Action Plan and SMR Leadership Table. So why is it so important for the nuclear sector to be included in Canada's Green Bond framework?
Well, first off, nuclear works. Right here in Ontario, nuclear provided 90% of the energy required to power through our coal phase out, which again was North America's greatest greenhouse gas reduction. So it works. The second thing is that bond financing is really important. It's how we've built a lot of the big infrastructure projects in our country, like the Niagara Falls hydro dams or the James Bay project. We've got a lot of work to do ahead of us. It's estimated that we need to build something like another 112 large hydro dams or 96 large CANDU reactors worth of power generation. And we need access to low interest capital in order to fund those projects.
Now, in the government's response, they also pointed out to countries like Austria and Belgium as examples of nations that are currently excluding nuclear energy in their green bond frameworks. But you, on the other hand, are pointing to other countries investing in more nuclear stations. So can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Well, it's a little bit puzzling why the government isn't up to date on the state of green finance. Just in July of this year, the European Union included nuclear within its sustainable finance taxonomy. And just last week, South Korea included nuclear within its green bond framework as well. I'm not sure that Belgium and Austria are countries that we should be following. Both of them are quite anti nuclear in terms of their current governments. And in Belgium, for instance, they just shut down on Friday a nuclear plant that provides 10% of their electricity to their entire country. And this is in the midst of an energy crisis gripping Europe, the most serious energy crunch since the OPEC crisis in the 1970s. So I think we need to choose carefully which examples we follow, and there are some good ones, and we should be showing leadership, not following examples of these countries that are botching their energy transition.
So, what do we know so far about how nuclear energy compares to other forms of green energy, like wind and solar, in terms of decarbonization and cost effectiveness?
Well, you need to look no farther than the example of Germany, which has spent over $500 billion on a wind and solar driven energy transition. But they've not done what we did right here in Canada and Ontario. They still rely on coal as the number one source of electricity on their grid, which is really pretty shocking. If they had invested that money in nuclear, they would have a completely decarbonized electricity grid, and they wouldn't be at the whims of someone like Vladimir Putin, who just shut off the taps on their gas supply. You know, when the wind doesn't cooperate, when the sun's not shining, we rely on things like coal and natural gas to keep the lights on. But nuclear operates around the clock, day after day, month after month, running for years at a time.
All right, Dr. Kiefer, what about environmental concerns around the generation of nuclear waste?
Well, nuclear waste is an interesting topic. Fresh out of the reactor, nuclear waste is very dangerous. It needs to be shielded, but we know how to do that quite well. And in the history of stored civilian nuclear waste, there's not been a single death associated with that. After about 1,000 years, though, that radioactivity decays away very quickly to the point that you can actually hold nuclear waste in your hand at that time interval. Now, longer than that, we have safe deposition we can do in stable geologic rock formations where we can hold it until that waste will have decayed to the level of the uranium ore from which it was originally mined. We produce very little nuclear waste. I was just visiting the Bruce Nuclear Generating Station and touring their waste facility. It's the largest operating nuclear plant in the world. And all of the waste that they've ever produced fits in a warehouse about the size of a Costco. It's just sitting there. It's not warming the atmosphere. It's not polluting the air. So we have the long-term solutions. And I think we really need to re-examine this preconception that people have about nuclear waste.
All right, Dr. Chris Kiefer, thank you again for your time today on Forum Daily.
It's a pleasure joining you. Thank you for having me.
Stay with us. Up next, we've got more news from around the world as 15 people are dead following a school shooting in Russia. Iran's Guard targets Kurdish bases in Iraq using drone strikes and artillery. And military clashes and infighting resume in Libya, with at least 5 people dead. These stories and more coming up after the break. Russian authorities say that 15 people are dead and many others are wounded in a school shooting. The shooting took place in school number 88 in Izhevsk, a city 960 kilometers east of Moscow. Russia's investigative committee says there isn't a known motive yet, but the gunman who killed himself was wearing a black T-shirt with Nazi iconography on it. Meanwhile, a young man shot a Russian military commander at close range on Monday. It was an unusually bold attack, reflecting growing resistance to Moscow's efforts to mobilize hundreds of thousands of men to wage war on Ukraine. The shooting comes after scattered arson attacks on enlistment offices and protests in Russian cities, which resulted in at least 2,000 arrests. Russia is seeking to bolster its military as its Ukraine offensive has bogged down and sapped its forces. Turning to tensions in Iran, where a semi-official news agency says the powerful Revolutionary Guard has used drone strikes and artillery. This was to target what Tehran says are bases of Iranian Kurdish separatists in northern Iraq. It is the second of such cross-border assaults since the weekend. This comes at a time when Iran is convulsing with protests over the death of a 22-year-old Iranian Kurdish woman. She was detained by the nation's morality police. On Saturday, the Guard said it targeted the training camps of Kurdish separatists. The semi-official Tasnim news agency said the Guard's attacks on Monday were in response to the support that the separatists have allegedly provided for the unrest in Iran and their attempts to smuggle in weapons. Global economic growth continues to be impacted by Russia's war in Ukraine. This is according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It says the events are dragging down global economic growth more than expected and driving up inflation that will stay high into next year. The organization projects worldwide growth to be a modest 3% this year before slowing to just 2.2% next year. The war in Ukraine has driven up food and energy prices worldwide, which has led the OECD to project annual economic growth to slow to around 1.5% in the U.S. and to 1.25% in the 19 countries using the euro currency. All right, moving to Libya now, where local officials say that a new round of infighting between rogue militias in the country's west has killed at least 5 people. This is including a 10-year-old girl. It is the latest bout of violence to rock the North African nation, which is mired in decade-long chaos. The fighting broke out on Sunday between rival militias in the western town of Zawiya. This is where armed groups, like in many other towns and cities in oil-rich Libya, are competing for influence. Health authorities said that along with the 5 who were killed, at least 13 other civilians were wounded in the fighting, which continued into Monday. Hurricane Ian is getting closer to the Cayman Islands, with a path that's expected to cross over western Cuba and Florida as a major hurricane this week. Authorities in Cuba have planned evacuations as Ian gets stronger on its approach. Hurricane Ian is expected to build strength over the Gulf of Mexico and become a major hurricane by tonight. The Brothers of Italy party has won the most votes in Italy's national election. The party has its roots in the post-War II neo-fascist Italian social movement. Giorgia Meloni has taken Brothers of Italy from a fringe far-right group to Italy's biggest party. Ms. Meloni is poised to lead Italy's first far-right-led government since the World War II and become its first female premier. Some big moves in Cuba, where voters have approved a sweeping family law code allowing same-sex couples to marry and adopt. Official news media say the measure passed by 66.9% to 33.1% in a national referendum. The reforms met unusually strong open resistance from the growing evangelical movement in Cuba. This is despite an extensive government campaign in favor of the measure. The sweeping code would allow surrogate pregnancies, broader rights for grandparents in regard to grandchildren, and protection of the elderly, as well as measures against gender violence. A police dog has been honored with the Thin Blue Paws Lifesaver Award after saving 38 people during her 8 years on the force. Scottish police officer Linda McBride partnered with Luna in 2012. Luna was skilled in searching and tracking high-risk missing people during her career. This includes a vulnerable man suffering from hypothermia who Luna found hidden in some bushes in December 2019. The 10-year-old German Shepherd retired in June, and she celebrated by going on her first ever vacation. She enjoyed swimming in the sea and playtime on the beach with her handler. What a well-deserved vacation. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.